A wounded wild leopard, trapped and left to die, had no one willing to risk saving him, except Ethan Barnes. Facing not just the savage injury, but also the wrath of the leopard's fierce mate, Ethan stood alone against the wild's unforgiving law. Yet with one act of courage and a bond no one could have predicted, destiny took a turn that no one saw coming. And just wait until you see how this story proves that even in the heart of the wilderness, true loyalty and justice find a way. Ethan Barnes had been captivated by the wild ever since he could remember. Growing up in a small town tucked into the rugged hills of Montana, he spent his childhood with a battered telescope handed down from his father, watching deer, foxes, and the occasional wandering bear move through the dense forests. To Ethan, the wilderness wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing world full of silent struggles and unseen stories. As he grew older, that quiet love turned into a calling. He became a volunteer for an organization called Wild Hope, a team dedicated to rescuing injured animals caught in the cruel traps left by poachers in some of the most remote corners of the country. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly wasn't safe, but for Ethan, it was the only life that ever made sense. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan received an urgent call that made his heart skip a beat. Deep within a wildlife preserve straddling the border between Arizona and New Mexico, a wild leopard had been discovered, trapped, injured, and dangerously aggressive. The local rangers had deemed it too risky to intervene. The animal's strength and ferocity made any rescue attempt life-threatening. But Ethan didn't see a threat when he heard the report. He saw a creature in agony, a life worth saving. When he finally reached the site before him made his stomach twist. There, thrashing against a brutal metal trap, was a magnificent leopard. Its coat a dazzling tapestry of gold and black, now marred with blood and torn fur. The great cat's roars filled the air, each one raw and ragged with pain. Around them, the dry grass was stained with crimson, and tufts of fur clung to broken branches, like desperate cries for help. Ethan knew one thing with terrifying clarity. One wrong move, one misplaced breath, and this encounter could end very badly. But retreating wasn't an option, not for him. Slowly, methodically, Ethan prepared his tools, a makeshift splint and a tranquilizer dart loaded into a lightweight rifle. Every step he took toward the leopard felt like crossing a line between life and death. The big cat lashed out, baring its teeth, muscles coiled in pain and rage. Ethan froze, lowering his eyes in a show of submission, and to his astonishment, the leopard responded, if only slightly, easing its aggressive stance, sensing perhaps that this man meant no harm. The sky above was starting to dim into the cool blues of evening. Time was slipping away, and with it, the leopard's strength. Ethan made a decision. He stood tall but kept his arms raised loosely in a gesture of peace. Speaking softly, his voice barely more than a whisper against the wild hush of the wind, he said, "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help. Just trust me. Just a little." For a moment, everything hung in a delicate balance. Then, the leopard, trembling from exhaustion, lowered its massive head ever so slightly. Without wasting a second, Ethan fired the tranquilizer. Within moments, the fierce body that had been a whirlwind of agony grew still, breathing heavily but safely under sedation. Working quickly and carefully, Ethan pried open the jaws of the brutal trap, freeing the injured paw. Blood seeped into the earth, but the wound was clean enough to treat. Using strong canvas straps, he lifted the now unconscious leopard onto a makeshift stretcher fashioned from his camping gear. As the stars began to prick the evening sky, Ethan knew he was racing against more dangers than just the fading light. Predators roamed these forests, and dragging an injured apex predator through unfamiliar terrain was asking for trouble. But looking down at the vulnerable creature he had fought so hard to save, Ethan felt no fear. There was only one thing that mattered now. He had to get this leopard to safety. No matter what it cost. The trail down to the truck proved far more brutal than Ethan had anticipated. The leopard, heavy and unmoving on the makeshift stretcher, weighed down his every step. The forest around him seemed to close in, the fading light playing tricks on the trees and the silence broken only by the ominous snap of twigs and the occasional low rustle of something unseen. Halfway down the steep incline, Ethan froze. From behind him came a low, guttural growl, deep, resonant, and unmistakably close. Turning slowly, heart pounding in his ears, he spotted a shadow moving between the trees. Emerging from the gloom was another leopard, a female. Her body tensed with a mixture of fear, anguish, and unspoken fury. Her eyes locked onto him, burning with something far deeper than instinct, something Ethan instinctively understood. In that moment, realization hit him with brutal clarity. He had taken her mate. He hadn't just stumbled into her territory, he had disrupted a bond forged in survival and trust. Terror tightened around Ethan's chest like a vice. He couldn't abandon the injured male lying helpless at his feet, but neither could he hope to defend himself if the female chose to attack. His hands trembled, his breathing slowed to shallow, cautious pulls of air. He knew one sudden move could unleash a disaster he had no hope of stopping. The female moved closer, her muscles rippling with tension beneath her spotted coat. He could feel the heat of her breath against his skin, even through the fabric of his shirt. Close enough now that any thought of escape vanished. But she didn't lunge. She didn't bare her teeth or roar in rage. Instead, her gaze shifted past Ethan, to the stretcher, to the broken figure of her companion. And then, the forest bore witness to something extraordinary. With slow, heartbreaking tenderness, the female approached the stretcher. She pressed her nose against the injured leopard's bloodied paw, nuzzling it with trembling urgency. And then, she let out a sound unlike anything Ethan had ever heard. A long, anguished cry, raw and piercing, tore through the night air. It was a sound of grief, of desperation, of a love too fierce to be contained in silence. Ethan stood motionless, unable to breathe, overcome by the raw, terrible beauty unfolding before him. Gone was the fearsome predator he had dreaded moments ago. Before him was a creature capable of a depth of emotion that shattered every human assumption about the wild. The leopardess, with a grace Ethan hadn't thought possible under such agony, slowly lay down beside the stretcher. Her body curled protectively around her wounded mate, as if to shield him from further harm. Tears blurred Ethan's vision. He no longer saw danger. He saw devotion. The forest seemed to hush around them, a sacred pause in the endless struggle for survival. But the journey down was far from over, and the threats that lurked in the deepening darkness had not vanished. With a trembling but determined heart, Ethan tightened his grip on the stretcher and prepared to move forward, carrying not just the weight of a wounded leopard, but the fragile, breathtaking bond he had just witnessed. By sunrise, Ethan finally reached the camp, exhausted, his clothes torn and stained. The male leopard lay sedated on the stretcher, while the female, who had followed them all night, rested quietly by the tent's entrance, never leaving his side. Soon, the hum of an engine broke the silence. The veterinary team had arrived. They stared in disbelief, not just at the rescued male, but at the fierce loyalty of the female. Ethan stayed close, watching as the vets cleaned and treated the injured paw. The female never attacked, only growled lowly if anyone moved too fast, protecting him with silent strength. When the treatment was complete, the vets made a bold decision: release them together. No one knew what would happen, but when the gates opened, the male didn't run. He turned, stumbled a few steps, and looked straight at Ethan, their eyes locked. A deep, wild, wordless thank you. Then, with a soft, almost human sound, the leopard said goodbye. The female gave Ethan one last look, and together they disappeared into the mist. Ethan stood still, knowing that something inside him had changed forever. He hadn't just saved a life, he had touched the very soul of the wild, and it had touched him back